up topics that are very relevant in in today's conduction of science projects, and is also part of like the larger discussion on big team science that's been happening more and more recently. Like there are a few panels on it at SIPS and at the Meta Science Conference, and here as well. So yeah, we'll just be talking about some of the main topics that we discussed during these panels and what some of the key takeaways are that we thought of, and then we'll also just briefly mention the tangible outputs that we are planning based off of these panels. Yeah, and Savannah was also one of our panelists, so she will have a lot to say on her role at PSA and how that relates to multi-country replications and stuff like that. But before we discuss the panels, I'm just going to request control of the screen now. But before we discuss the panels, I'm just going to introduce the program which hosted the panels. We are the Junior Researcher Program. And what we do, just waiting for the slide to go ahead. Yes. So we are a global initiative for students and early career researchers in behavioral sciences. You can follow us at the below links. We have a website, a Facebook, and we're also Junior Researcher Program on Instagram and Twitter if you are interested in updates. So yeah, we have basically our program revolves around a 1-week summer school, usually in July, that helps develop projects with the help of early career researchers under the mentorship of PhD students or postdocs or more senior researchers. So we have usually 3 or 4 projects that are led by PhDs and postdocs, etc. And we have lots of undergraduates and early career researchers interested in getting involved in research who apply to our program, and we select participants based off of their applications, and then they join us in the summer school. Normally they're held in person in a select location, but for the past 2 years they've been held online because of COVID, but hopefully we'll get back to in-person summer schools next year. So our JRP program for early career researchers is a 13-month program with a meeting in between, in the middle of that program, to catch up with each other and to meet up with your project's teammates, and then meet up with the people from the other projects and stuff like that. So the 13 months begins at the summer school. And then we also have many opportunities throughout those 13 months to disseminate research, both for the early career researchers and undergraduates who were part of the summer school, as well as other researchers external to JRP or alumni of JRP. We also have a 5-week internship and a 3-day annual conference that kind of brings together early career and later stage researchers. So this is just like the calendar, a typical calendar year of the Junior Researcher Program. And once the participants of the summer school graduate, they'll always be a part of our team. And we've had many researchers who were a part of the program go on to pursue PhDs and other sort of research related roles in the future. So here are some other highlights of our program as well. Yeah, and you can see a lot of our publications on our social media and stuff. So introduction to our panels. So basically we wanted to discuss different approaches that researchers who have taken part in multi-country replication studies have had. So we kind of wanted to span a range of topics relating to multi-country replication, MCRs, as I will call them from now. Yeah, so we had 2 different panels, and these were the panelists in each of them. As you can see, we had 9 panelists, and I moderated one of the sessions, and Savannah was one of the panelists in the session that I moderated. We had panelists from all around the world, as you can see, which was very insightful for us. Yeah, we'll just talk a bit more about that later on. Okay, so I'll hand it over to you.
I don't have access to give this person like admission because you have some control.
Okay, I did.
So sorry.
No
Carry on.
Yeah, I think this is, I gave you control again.
Awesome. Yeah, so one of the questions that we asked all of our panelists was on how we actually propose and come up with the ideas of our studies. And so, as you probably know, there's not a standard for how we do replication studies, especially for multi-country replication studies. And so several different techniques were kind of highlighted during the panel. And so people who don't do research with big team science organizations said mostly that they do their own PI's interest, or like if it's their own interest. And so they'll come up with a question that has a psychological construct in mind, but they want to test it with other countries or cultures to see how that interacts and to see if there's a generalizability between that social construct. Whereas like our big team science organizations like Many Babies, Many Primates, and the PSA kind of do a different approach, where we, at the PSA, we do a call for submissions. And so what this means is that we will give an idea or sometimes just like a vague call. And so people from in the PSA or just externally can submit ideas on what kind of applications they want to do. And our study selection committee will go over those and see the different kind of criteria that I'll go through in a second. And then we'll vote to whether or not that study will get actually done in the PSA. And I know Many Babies has the same kind of construct, but they do it a little differently, where they don't submit like a call, but they have people who will give ideas to leadership. And so that is the way that they choose their studies. And so one of the biggest criteria is that almost all of our panelists suggested was feasibility of the actual study. And so what this means is, do we have the resources to do this study? Will it be something that we can actually implement across different labs? Is it simple enough? Is it easy for people who might not have any special equipment to do? As well as, do we have the money to pay and to find people to actually implement the studies in different countries? We also have found that most of the replications that are meta science or multi-country are typically done in social or cognitive research, just because it doesn't typically require a lot of special equipment. Another criteria that our panelists highlighted was the durability. So is this idea that the person is proposing something that still withstands the time of psychology? Will it have an impact? And if it is something that we expect to continue to have an impact on our field. And so if it's something that is mostly time-based, it might not be a study that we actually want to accept because it's not going to be as durable to our field. We also talked about different suitabilities. So for ethics, whether or not there's any major ethical concerns. So we're not going to do a replication study on the Stanford prison experiment just because that has major ethical concerns. And so ethics is one of the big ones that we also do. We also talked about publications. And so a lot of people who want to publicize their research are wanting novel ideas. And so this is where extensions come in. And so by extensions, that can mean a couple different things. Our publication journals want to have novel ideas. And so we need to add something that's actually adding to the study. And sometimes that's literally just the study was done on weird participants. So westernized, educated participants like our typical white college student. So adding multi-countries is part of the extension itself. We also talked a lot about generalizability. And so one of our panelists, Alexandra, said this quote, which I think sums up perfectly what we are doing when we do replication studies, which says most work is not directly about the replication, but more about the test of generalizability. And so we're not looking to bash the people who did the original study. What we're looking for is, does this study actually stand in other countries? Is it something that is only to the white American or European cultures, or is it something that actually works across the entire world regions? And so we're not trying to bash or disprove or come in with a lot of doubt, but more we're looking for generalizability. And I will give it back to you.
Yeah, thanks. But I, by the way, don't think I need control of the slides anymore, but yeah. So another topic that we spent a while discussing was how the different approaches to identifying and approaching collaborators for MCRs. So basically, a major subtopic in that was, how do we differentiate between getting non-weird data versus non-weird collaborators? So, you know, maybe in the recent past, a kind of perspective was that we need a lot of non-weird sort of participants, but there was less consideration given to actually having non-weird collaborators as a core part of your team. So that was something that everyone kind of agreed was an area that psychological science needs to improve on. So basically, in approaching collaborators from so-called non-weird countries or regions of the world, we would need to take into consideration differences in resource availability. So of course, many regions of the world and many universities aren't as well funded as those in Western countries or weird populations and your typical sort of areas of the world where most research is published, or where kind of, you know, institutions where that or a lot of research originates. So you have to give consideration to that when you're approaching collaborators, because as a more well-funded institution, you'd have to think about like whether you would be able to help your collaborating institute or researcher in getting access to whatever resources you need. And this is especially true for clinical psychology related studies, because a lot of times you would need to like train people, train psychologists, or train students in certain clinical techniques. And there might not even be psychologists available to train. So you'd have to kind of adapt certain psychological techniques or something, or maybe send one of the main PIs who is a psychologist to that region. So all that, of course, requires resources and money. So yeah, there's kind of like that resource imbalance, which you would need to like think about and think of ways in which both parties can like come up with solutions for that. And not just kind of expect the collaborators to take on the brunt of recruitment activities without the required resources and without like adequate help, or like, yeah, just kind of having the knowledge to like take on certain recruitment activities on their own. And then the other thing that is really required is a deep cultural understanding of the regions that you are going into and studying. So again, this is where you need collaborators, like researchers from that region of the world or that country or culture or whatever, in your core team, and not just not just in your recruitment phase, which brings me to the next point, which is equity in the level of involvement of your collaborators. So, you know, there was one of our panelists, Hansika, who works at a research institute in India, talked about how sometimes she would get requests for collaboration that basically asked her to like collect data and that's it. So of course there's a lot of like power imbalance in that kind of request, and almost like disrespect in asking someone to just collect data for you and not be involved in any other aspect of the research, such as like design or like adapting the study to local cultural contexts and stuff like that. So yeah, that is an area that we really need to improve on as well. And then of course there's security and safety of your collaborators and participants. There might be certain topics that you're trying to study, or you know, trying to like generalize a theory within, that have a lot of political and cultural connotations in certain areas of the world. And collaborators, like researchers, might be putting themselves in some sort of danger or at risk of kind of, I don't know, losing their jobs or even being arrested or imprisoned and stuff like that if they engage in certain areas of research. So that needs to be taken into account before approaching collaborators, because even the act of like sending them an email, asking them like, oh, we really want to like collaborate with you, would you like consider this? That can also be seen as a little bit like pressuring, and might make them want to like collaborate with you, even if it might not be actually safe for them. So yeah, that's just another thing to think about. We briefly touched on cold emailing versus contacting people that you already know through your networks. Or and Savannah also mentioned that when PSA gets requests for collaboration, it really helps when there's like a personal touch. So like maybe mentioning working with someone who is a part of PSA, working like having worked with one of your colleagues, like it would help to mention that. And Alexandra also mentioned that her experience with cold emailing wasn't as successful as contacting people through her networks or people that she already knew, or like a colleague of a colleague, that kind of stuff. So that's also an interesting thing to know. But of course, like sometimes cold emailing does work, depending on like how much time you have to spend on this. Like it might be worth cold emailing people anyway. But yeah, always, of course, I think we all know by now, like using your networks is always like the best first step. Yeah, I don't know if Savannah has anything else to add to this area.
Nope, I think you did it well.
Okay, yeah. Yes, so the next slide is also me. And so related to the weird, non-weird conversation, we were talking about how to best kind of include participants from underrepresented populations. And so these were the main kind of points that we discussed that researchers should keep in mind. So first of all, translation, that's a pretty common consideration, especially in like social science, cognitive, economic, like behavioral science related topics, because a lot of those studies involve surveys that you would translate. So translation is one of the main sort of challenges in like multi-country or cross-cultural replication research. And we kind of just talked about like the best ways of translation, and it seemed to be like the gold standard of back translating, like translating and then back translating was the most commonly used method. And then we also mentioned that like some of the demographic questions may need to be like completely changed and adapted to different cultural contexts. For example, like in some areas of the world, it's like not acceptable to ask about your ethnicity, or ethnicity isn't really a salient marker, but maybe caste is, or language, or like the tribe you come from, that kind of stuff might be more relevant. So you'd have to like change questions relating to that. And then, like I mentioned before, funding differences. Whenever there's a sort of like imbalance of like funding between like the people trying to, and even like economic status between people who are researching and then the participants, there's always this question of like, should you be paying participants for their time, or is that kind of, you know, unethical as well? So that's like an entirely different conversation that we can talk about for hours. But yeah, that's one of the things to think about. Like, do you have the resources to compensate people for their time and effort? Is money the best way to compensate them, or are there other ways and other like resources that they're that are more relevant or more like useful? So like maybe psychoeducation classes, or like therapy session with a therapist, like that kind of stuff might also be of interest to participants. Yeah, and so as I mentioned before, again, training and providing resources to people who are helping you collect data, especially when you're talking about clinical things, or if you're having people go out and like have people answer surveys in person, they would need appropriate training to like ask them the questions properly, especially in like areas where there's like low literacy rates. That might be a more like relevant point where you'd have to have someone go and like ask people the questions one by one, and you know that requires like a particular set of skills of research. Yeah, and then obviously you'd have to approach topics from a non-weird mindset. So just to think about like what questions, for example, people may or may not be willing to answer, if people would be more willing to answer like certain types of questions if they were asked by a man or a woman, in the case of like face-to-face questions, that kind of stuff. And then an important point is, does the project actually have value to the stakeholders, aka the participants? Like, will they benefit in some way from the research, either directly or indirectly? And how, this is related to dissemination of research, but how are you going to make sure that they do see the benefits of it, even if it's indirect? Like, they should be able to kind of access the research, or have some way of knowing how the research and the results in the end like relate to them, or like have any sort of benefit. And then, yeah, in terms of like validation, you'd have to think about if you're validating a scale, or you're trying to validate like a theory or something, like Savannah mentioned before, you have to think about that at the very beginning. Like, is this theory even relevant in certain populations? Is it even like a thing that people conceptualize in the same way in a different country? There are a lot of like clinical, like mental health issues that are not even thought of in the same way in different parts of the world. So if you're trying to like validate a scale, like a depression scale, or like a psychosomatic like problem scale, or anything like that, you have to first think about, and maybe even conduct some pilot qualitative studies or something about like seeing whether that kind of perspective exists in that country. Like, do people actually characterize depression in the same way or think of it as a clinical issue? So yeah, and then lastly, I briefly touched on this when I said like so-called weird populations, but there's also a whole conversation to be had about how useful it is to label populations as weird and non-weird, because in many cases, when people do cross-cultural replications, they end up sampling from populations that are in another country, but are still kind of, they still have weird characteristics. Like they might be college students in like a liberal arts university in an Asian country. Like that, how much of a difference does that actually contribute to in the populations? And can you really call that kind of like an entirely different population than the original one, when you would expect that population to already be highly educated, have kind of democratic characteristics, are rich, and are largely westernized in their like way of thinking and kind of work ethic and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's worth thinking about, like, if you, is it just weird? Is it non-weird if you just go to like a different continent, or are you actually sampling from like a weird subset in a different country? So yeah, that's all I have to say on this slide.
Move far. Yeah, so as she said, translation of materials is for sure one of the biggest way we approach and include collaborators from different countries, which is also sometimes disrespectful, especially if that is the only way that we are including them, is to ask them to translate it into their native language. And so that is still a major weakness of big team science and multi-country replications. She also mentioned that we do back and forth approach. And so what this means is that typically you have one or two people, and some of our panelists mentioned that sometimes having two different coders do both of the process can be sort of messy. And so what this would look like is to have somebody translate the English version into their native language and then have them back translate it, which is sometimes messy when you have two different people doing that at the same time. And so we always make sure that both of them come together at the end and communicate to figure out where the differences lie and how we can adapt those. For a lot of the big team science organizations like the PSA, we do like one person for each different part of the process. And so we would have one person translate it into their native language and then have the other person translate it back. And then we would send it to people who like are just random people who may know about the actual materials itself, but have no clue what you're trying to say to them, to see if it actually makes sense. We also talked a lot about making sure that our translations are very transparent. And so making sure to document every single step and detail and different changes, and making sure that once we have that documented, that we give that documentation to other people so that they can see where translations differ and how each different language may differ in its entirety. I think that's all I have about translations. For ethics, we talked a lot about whether or not you use one IRB or have several. And so typically what happens is that a lot of our panelists mentioned that they use one IRB from the lead team's university organization, and then have collaborators sign on that. And this works for most places, but there are also difficulties when it comes to other countries who don't have an IRB process. or that have stricter standards than your university. And so we talked a lot about how in Europe, they specifically want to make sure that if the IRB that you're signing on to has data protection standards. And so in Europe, they're very strict about making sure that each participant's rights are covered and that you do continue to make sure that it is anonymous in all aspects of research. And so if you are participating with other people in Europe, you want to make sure that there is no way to link the participant to your study. And so that's one of the big things that our Europeans deal with. We also have several different countries that don't have an IRB at all, which is problematic in the fact that like we require in big team science organizations that everybody has some kind of ethical approval before collecting data. And so in the PSA, what we do is we have people explicitly like write up a report that says like, hey, we do not do IRBs here. And so they're exempt from that, and we keep records of all of that. Whereas like other people will sign on to our lead, but mostly what we do is we have several different IRBs from every different lab, which is a little messy, but I think that it works really well, especially making sure that what we're doing is actually approved in several different aspects, and not relying on just one IRB. And so that is a big part of that. Another part is that sometimes if we can't get IRB approval in other countries, we just drop the collaborators, which isn't helpful, especially if we're trying to do multi-country replications. And we run into a lot of different IRBs requesting certain changes to the actual study, which is problematic, especially if you've done a register report and have already set all of the terms of the study. And so that is another way that sometimes we have to drop our collaborators. For data collection, we talked a lot about how we actually collect the data and whether or not that's centralized. So we have one location and one link to do all of the data collection, or if we use dispersed materials, so each lab has their own link and their own place to house the data. Most of our panelists agreed that centralized is better, just because it's a way to make sure that each person that is working on the data and data collection has a way to access their data, and that we don't have to wait on people to submit their data and then analyze it. And so it just kind of makes the process a little faster. But like I said, in Europe, this gets a little difficult, and we do have different adaptations that happen, especially when working with multi-countries, when you want to make sure that materials are sensitive to that country that the data is being collected in. And then we talked a lot about, well, we talked shortly about reporting and disseminating your findings. This is a pretty major lacking in most of our actual panelists. And so it's not something that we are great at doing, but we're getting better at it. And so a lot of people that do research on their own will use social media or newsletters to let their collaborators and their participants know kind of what's happening. And so Twitter and academic Twitter are major ways that we get information out about our studies. And a couple of our panelists had mentioned that they send newsletters out to like participants or like the guardians of their participants. So if they're doing developmental research on students or children, they want to make sure that their guardians know kind of what they did and what they found. And so keeping our participants in the loop about what actually they've contributed to. We also wanted to make sure that when we report and disseminate, we are keeping in mind what we're giving back to the community that we're using. And so we want to make sure that they do get access to the data, whether that's on OSF, like posting the data that way, or making sure that they have access to the journal articles that we write up with SciArchive, so that they don't have to pay for the pristine journals and they can still kind of get an idea of what they've contributed to. Whereas the PSA or other big team sciences use more of like selected journalists. So we kind of leak or give our information about what happened in our study and what we found to people that we trust, and they write it up in ways that are in ways that people can actually understand it. Yeah, so dissemination is for sure something we're still working on, but I think that even in the past couple of years, we've gotten significantly better at it.
Yeah, and I like what you mentioned, Savannah, about kind of making participants aware of what they've contributed to. Like that in itself can be sort of an indirect contribution that they can feel good about, even if they don't directly benefit, you know, in the short term. So yeah, it would be important to kind of like make them feel appreciated, and really show them how much we appreciate their time and effort. So yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so what were some of the key takeaways from our panels were that firstly, although there's a lot of kind of like collaboration within big team science consortia, like within each consortium, there also needs to be more like collaboration, and not necessarily collaboration, but discussion and dialogue between the initiatives. So people kind of are aware of like different approaches, like how PSA does stuff, or how like many babies or many labs might do things differently, and kind of be able to take and share ideas that way. Then secondly, we all agreed that it was important to plan your studies protocol well in advance. So consulting with national and international collaborators about potential pitfalls, thinking about all the things relating to translations, funding, resources, training, and all that stuff we mentioned earlier. Those things have to be discussed, and like, you know, major decisions should be made at the very beginning rather than like whenever you get to the topic of those things. Then thirdly, it's important to choose an effector theory that is realistic to test on a larger scale. So again, thinking about country differences in how a theory is perceived, or like how a theory is even conceptualized in different countries, like you need to think about that in advance before you kind of go on and start doing your study and then realize that, wait a minute, like this theory isn't even thought of in the same way as it is in the original studies that you're replicating. And then making sure that the safety of your colleagues, participants, and collaborators is guaranteed. And that ties into point 2 of planning your protocol in advance. Like you have to think about pretty much every step of your research in detail at the very beginning, and you can't just leave it until the end. And then in order to kind of like up the novelty aspect and the kind of potential that your study will be published, you should definitely consider some simple and straightforward extensions to the original replication, so that you're not only just strictly replicating the original study, but you might also be adding something new. Again, this may not be your primary focus, but it is something to consider depending on where you're planning on publishing. If it's a journal where they they're not really interested in strict replications, this might be necessary to get them interested in it. And then it might be worthwhile to standardize platforms and communication across a consortium and across like multiple consortia. So like I said, for point one, like if you talk to people from different initiatives and if there's more dialogue between them, that kind of helps standardize different processes, like where you share or keep your data and how you disseminate findings, etc. And yeah, and lastly, just to remember that your collaborators and your participants in different countries are just the forefront of a new way of doing social sciences, and that it is like what we're talking about now is a very big sort of turn in psychology and behavioral sciences into seeing all of these things, multi-country replications in general, as like crucial to good science rather than just like a bonus kind of add-on. So yeah, that's all for me. And yeah, if Savannah doesn't have anything else to add, that's the end of our presentation.
Anybody have questions? All right.
Oh, I forgot to mention, we are writing up a paper based on these panels with the contribution of all of our panelists as well. And in addition to the paper, we're planning on writing a guidance document, like a checklist of all the things that you should consider and think about when planning a multi-country replication. So it'll include like a lot of the things that we mentioned in our presentation, but in a more condensed and comprehensive checklist. So yeah, just stay tuned for that on our social media.
I would have a question. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really great. And what I'm always thinking, what always bothering me when I'm thinking even about such multicultural studies is, of course, this ethic approval. And you sum up it pretty nicely that it can be done in such way or in another way. And there are so many challenges. And my question is, how is it for the PSA? Are you secured enough, or do you have, if there will be someday some legal issues that, for example, one lab has provided a wrong statement, do you know, it won't be problems, so the papers of PSA will not be retracted? I don't know anything. It was my main fear that maybe afterwards this legal issue can lead to a retraction, and this would be, of course, a nightmare.
Yeah. I don't think I fully know the answer to your question, but I will speak to what I do know. And so I don't think that there is a chance that we would have that happen, especially because we have an entire committee and a person on each study that is explicitly focused on making sure that the ethical approvals are approved and that there's nothing weird happening within like the actual process of coming up with the study. And so that is one thing that, while it's difficult to like navigate in the time of actually getting everybody's IRB approvals, it's one thing that we are for sure diligent in making sure that we do know what is happening in each study and that several people know what's happening and have looked at it. And so, and I think that is also probably part of the reason why we do have each lab, if possible, submit their own IRB. And so it's just not like one Ashland University lab deciding that this is ethical enough. But we have labs from the entire PSA within reason, as long as they have an IRB, also making sure that there are no legal or ethical concerns about doing this study. So I think that's what I do know. Does that answer your question anyway?
Yes, I think it's really great, and of course, I also submitted my IRB, so I saw how it was happening in PSA. Yes, and yesterday there was a talk about this mini babies, and I was thinking, like as you said, what if someone wants to investigate clinical populations or maybe some other like children, if of course everything gets even more complicated. And that's why I wanted to know how you deal with the situation, because I learned that it's one of the major issues which might be its ethical approval, even if nothing really weird happening, but it's always, you always need to take care of it. So yeah, thank you for this insight.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi. I have a question or a comment when you talk about you have some communication with non-wield scholar, because I have a situation here, because many of my friends, you know, they are non-wield like me, but they have a well-willed education, so they think or behave like a willed scientist, and they have a common suggestion for the replication crisis. They say this is very normal, because you cannot replicate a study in different time and different place. So how so I am wondering if you have met this kind of comment, and how you respond this comment in your in any of your case.
I personally have not been a part of multi-country replications yet. I'm only just starting a cross-country replication myself. But if I understood the comment correctly, it was that it just isn't possible to replicate theories in a population other than like the original. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah, I don't know, like sometimes that occurs to me as well. Like I wonder if it is possible, but there have been quite a few studies that seem to replicate well in diverse populations, and I'm not just talking about like typically weird populations in like a different country, but even in like so-called non-weird populations. So I'm not sure, like I feel like there probably are a lot of theories that just wouldn't be the same or cannot be exactly replicated in different cultures. Like I said before, when I'm talking about like clinical psychology and that kind of stuff, that's a lot more like intimate and personal, and relates to like the way we think about emotions and yeah, and mental health and that kind of stuff. I'm not sure how replicable certain things would be.
Yeah, actually I have many the comments, like I say from the discipline you just mentioned, like emotion and discipline. They say you cannot replicate the study in US and in the country out of US is normal, but the series are looks like worse. So we still could use the theory from US and in our country. So that's it. I think this is a logical when we have done so many replication replication study, but there's still so many PP, so many non-willed researchers still buy it. So I think that this is a change, like your project.
Yeah, I get the point. Like, I do kind of agree to it to some extent, but of course I don't have like as much experience as other replication researchers. Like, yeah, like it is interesting that in a lot of sort of non-weird countries, like even in India, for example, in the case of like using certain scales for like psychologists and stuff, they go by what the American Psychological Association puts forth as like a gold standard. Like they'll use the Beck Depression Inventory, even if it might not be as culturally relevant. I mean, supposedly it's been replicated, or not replicated, but validated in various languages or cultures. But even if you take the English version and use it in like an Indian population that speaks English, that it just might not be valid. So I think it's a bit strange that people often take whatever the APA says and kind of use it in their own cultures. But yeah, I think that is changing now, fortunately. Yeah, I don't even think it's necessarily a bad thing that we can't replicate or validate certain things in different countries. I think it just needs to be seen as like expected, kind of. Like, yeah, that's fine. We wouldn't really expect things to be the same everywhere. So yeah, it's not really a failure of the study or research even, just But yeah, anyway, Savannah, if you have any comments, I've just been blabbing on.
No, you're good. I think that all of your points were spot on. I think the only thing that I would add is like, it's important that we, like I said this during the presentation, but it's important that we like don't come in with the idea of like, ha ha ha, I'm gonna prove these people wrong. Like this isn't gonna replicate. And so coming in with like doubt or suspicion of the original study, just like might not actually be valid. Like you said, like even just saying, how are you? If I said that to somebody else in a different country, they're gonna take that differently. Like that's just how we work. And so just like remembering that replications aren't always about like the doubt or suspicion that you have, but more about like, hey, does this sort of generalize to the entire world, or at least to some regions? And I think it's important to like make sure that when we're doing translations, the people that are translating the actual materials are understanding what we're trying to say in English, and trying to make sure that when they translate it, that they're giving the same kind of expression or connotation that they like that we're trying to express in their actual native language. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, but whatever that, this is a very big issue. So I think we will talk this in many times. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Your presentation is great. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiaochen.
Thank you for attending. Yeah, thanks everyone for attending.